I had a question the other day in the comments and it says, how do you not get the swirl marks using the orbital sander? So I want to answer that. I did answer it in a comment form, but I want to answer it in video form because I think it's sometimes a commonly misunderstood thing. Just so you know, I'm just going to talk to the camera for the most part on this and explain some stuff. If that's not really your jam, feel free to skip, back out, whatever you need to do. Orbital sanders work this direction, but they also work in a direction that sometimes you can't see. So not only are they gonna spin, they're kind of bouncing around like this at the same time. So what it ends up looking like is something like this. So imagine if you're scrubbing a window or something. You're going in circles, but you're also moving in a circle at the same time. And that's what these are doing. Now there's a couple of different sanders that I have here on the table. We're not really gonna compare them because I don't think that's necessary for this, but I do have them out here because I want to show you guys some key differences in the two of them for a couple of reasons. Bear with me. So this is the Festool ETS EC 125/3 EQ because Festool charges by the character. This is the Makita BO5030. In my opinion, if you're in the market for a sander and you're watching this video, which is how to get rid of pigtails in your material, you're probably in this category. If you're not happy with the sander that you have and it is not the Makita, buy the Makita. In my experience, I've had both the Makitas. They have another one that has a handle here and a trigger lock and variable speed and all that. I've had this one and the other one for years and years and years, and they're great. I did upgrade to this and I have my reasons, but these are great. There's a reason I still have them in the shop even though I have the Festool. Probably the $60 range, maybe $80 for the other one. I've used the Rigid. Used the DeWalt a couple times, so I don't have a lot of experience there. I've used the Bosch. I don't recommend it unless they've fixed it. The Bosch didn't ever have a flat pad here, so it causes issues. If you were to turn the Bosch on and sit it on a piece of wood and then lift it up, you'd have a donut on here. It wasn't flat, and that causes a lot of issues and will cause major swirl marks, as we're going to talk about here in just a second. So anyways, I do highly recommend the Makitas. They're very good dollar to value. Now, in my experience, the two main reasons I've ever gotten swirl marks or pigtails in the product that I'm sanding is for two different reasons. One, I'm moving too fast. I'm physically moving from one end of the board to the other just too quickly. It's not necessarily the speed on the sander, but just how quickly I'm rushing through my job. And the other one would be any kind of debris that gets between the pad and the disc, wedged into these little holes, or if I get a little tear right here on the edge and that starts creating swirl marks. So we're gonna touch on both of those, and then I'm gonna give you guys a few other little things that could be causing the problems and a couple of ways that you can learn to sand better, and a couple of ways to maybe hide the mistakes if you do end up with them. All right, so as far as sanding speed goes, believe it or not, the general rule of thumb, if you haven't heard this before, is 1 inch per second. So if we lay a ruler here and we start to go, we'll take this off of here. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's unbearable. It's so freaking slow. When you are used to getting on here and just going like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's excruciating. And this is just one board. Imagine if I have a whole table. I still find it hard to slow down, even though I've known about this for a long time. It's just because, you know, designing and building and assembling and all the things is really fun. Sanding, it's just not fun. I just don't get any enjoyment out of it. Anyways, so it's really hard to slow down, but I'm telling you, if you slow down, you're going to speed up the overall job because you're going to give this machine a chance to do it at once. This is 12,000 RPM, which is, wow, that's really fast. So anyways, remember we're working like this, right? But we're kind of going like one of these numbers. So each time this thing spins around, it's also moving this all over the place. If you were just to spin it once and you go, and then you lift off and only spin it once, you'd have some terrible scratch marks in here. So this thing needs to be able to spin around over and over and over and over and over again and cover up those last scratch marks. And the random part of the random orbital sander is that it's putting them in random places. It repeats that pattern, but it still is random in comparison to the last scratch pattern that it made. So it goes once, it makes a scratch pattern, it goes again, it covers up that scratch pattern with a different one. And if you move too fast, you're going to see those scratch patterns go along the way. And that's where you're getting those pigtails from. I thought of an example. Hopefully this is one last step to help someone understand this. If you have a row of 50 people and you have fresh snow, that first person that walks through the snow is gonna leave their own little footprints, right? If you get a second person in here, and we think of that as like the first scratch pattern, the second person that walks that exact same path is maybe got a shorter stride. So they're gonna make their own set, and some of them are gonna land in the same spot as the first person's footprints, but for the most part, it's gonna look like two kind of scattered footprints. By the time you get to 50, there isn't even snow on that trail anymore. It's just mushed into a flattened abyss. That's exactly what this is doing. Hopefully that helps somebody to really understand what's going on here. We need to slow down and let the sander and the disc do its work. Now, one thing that can happen is that your disc, the quality of your disc can be bad. And by quality of your disc, I don't necessarily mean whether you got it from the dollar store or from a high-end tool manufacturer. What I mean is how is it lasting on your sander? These 3M Cubitron ones, you guys know, if you've been watching for a while, that I really do like these. They're not paper, and so they don't end up tearing. A lot of times with the paper back discs, you'll get the edges, the sandpaper part will tear off of the backing. And then what happens is that ends up being a little bump or where that tear is at, and it will cause swirl marks. This pad needs to be flat, just like this needs to be flat. So that when you mate the two together, they're both flat, it's still flat, and I can sand flat, right? As long as I'm not tilting the sander to one side or the other, I should be able to glide this along here, and it should just do its little thing the whole way through without getting scratch marks. But if I either one, have a piece of debris stuck in here, and if you've ever sanded anything rough like a cedar fence board or reclaimed wood, you'll get a splinter that breaks off, especially towards an edge, and a splinter will get shoved into one of the holes, especially if you're using something more like this. These two don't match, but just bear with me. It'll get wedged into one of these little holes and it'll stick out. And what's happening is that is causing different type of pressure to be applied in that one little spot only. And just like the people walking in the snow, if one of them was to walk off the trail, there's no one there to erase his tracks, and his tracks stand out. And that's what's gonna happen here too. So that one little piece is gonna sit in here and you're gonna end up with stuff all over the place. And what's worse, it's gonna be random and weird throughout. Fun fact, I used this one, I think it was this one, on my table saw. When I first got it, I ended up getting some rust on it right away. And I used a worn disc because I just didn't want to break out a new disc. And I didn't realize that I had a little crease in the side right here. And I ended up with swirl marks on my table saw top, which was brand new at the time. But there was just random little rainbows of swirl marks on there because I was using an old disc, totally bit me in the butt. Since then, I believe they're all gone. But it's just another one of those times where I got in a hurry and I got lazy and I did the wrong thing. So check these, make sure that you don't have anything wedged in there or stuck in the little Velcro loops because that happens as well, and you should be good to go. Now, one thing that doesn't really get talked about, but this actually happens to me more than anything, is let's say that this board is actually joined to this board and this has now become one piece. Rarely do our pads and our discs, rarely are they ever the same size. I got this one actually on here pretty decent, but you might be able to see there's still a lip right here. So what happens, and especially with the paperback ones, is if I come in here and I'm gonna come down here to sand, first of all, there's a lip right here. This board's just a little tiny bit thicker than this one. So let's say I had a milling error, but I thought, I'll just sand this down. That's fine. But as I come through here, this paper is gonna catch on this lip and it's going to tear or it's going to crease and it's gonna leave a little bump right here. And again, that bump is gonna come through here and it's gonna leave swirl marks. So in this situation, come through here this way, don't let it taper off. If you do have a piece that's a little thicker right here and it's a piece you care about, it makes sense just to get a hand plane, a chisel or something, and just try to smooth that out, not a hard bump like this. And then you can kind of sneak through here, but don't let it fall this way because the same thing will happen. It'll come through, it'll catch on this edge, it'll start tearing up the edge of this paper. The same thing can happen if you run it into the side of a wall. So say you're in the side of a box and you're sanding this in here because you forgot to sand before you assembled. And you run it up against here, you'll beat the edge of your sandpaper up every time you hit that wall. It'll destroy the side of the sandpaper disc, and then you're gonna end up with that same problem. So again, slowing down 1 inch per second, and then making sure that your sandpaper discs are actually clean, flat, that the pad is flat, and that there's nothing in between them to screw them up. Those, in my opinion, in my experience, are the 2 main reasons for pigtails. Now, if you're watching this video and you're wondering how to get away from pigtails, you probably have a sander more like this, which means you're probably using a shop vac for dust collection, or at least I hope you are, because dust is horrible for you, as we've all been told a million times, but only some of us actually worry about it. Anyways, with the higher end sanders, if you have a higher end sander and you're still actually watching this video, thank you, but you probably have a dust extractor and not a shop vac. With your dust extractor, you probably have a way to turn the vacuum down. Turn the vacuum down. There's no reason to run it on full suction speed because it's not gonna do anything better than what it did before. With these sanders, dust collection is at the top of the list in their design process. With these sanders, it's more of a convenient afterthought, like, oh, maybe they'd want that. But it's not at the front of their minds when they design these. So this sander, if I hook the dust hose or the dust extractor hose up to it, and I don't turn the sander on, I could actually pick this board up because the suction is so strong. Even with it dialed down, it'll pick up quite a bit of stuff. You can actually vacuum with it. So if I have a pile of dust on the counter or on the table, I can turn the vacuum on and I can actually vacuum with the holes in this sander because the connection between here and here is so good. So I don't need a lot of volume of air and a high suction in order to get this thing to get the dust picked up. And even at its lowest setting, I swear it seems like it's 99.5% of the dust just disappears and ends up in the collector. It's amazing. But again, you're probably working on a system like this and you have a shop vac. That's what I had to do for many years. You're probably also having some sort of jerry-rigged adapter that goes from here, because all of these dust ports are different sizes, to your shop vac because there's so many different sizes of shop vac hoses. What you can do, because you won't have a way to turn down the suction without getting some extra parts and pieces online somehow, is you can just drill a hole right here and then put a piece of tape on here to act as a door. So what's gonna happen is instead of all that suction coming down into here, you open that door up and it's gonna start pulling suction from here, which means it can't pull the same amount of suction from here. Get a couple adapters, try it out and see what you like and what you don't like. You could put a couple of holes in here if you're really worried about it. I have complete variable suction. I just go from nothing or all. So I think you only need one hole to do this, but that will help it to not pull so hard in here. But that being said, again, it's more of an afterthought with these, so the dust collection is not that great anyways. But what's happening is it's sucking the sander down to the material, and that's not a good thing. You should only have to have the weight of your hand and the weight of the machine in order to sand, which kind of leads me to my next point, which is stop digging into the material, because that's going to cause you to get a lot of pigtails and swirl marks too. But having that high suction and pulling this to the material is going to cause it to dig in unnecessarily hard, and that's going to end up giving you swirl marks. So turn that suction down, or do the whole drill a hole trick if you have to, and keep from pushing down and digging into the material. If you really have to work to get something out, you're probably running too high of a grit. So go to a lower grit and start there. But you never want to dig into the material. You'll burn your sander out, you'll wear your sandpaper out, and obviously you're going to end up with a lot of sanding marks. Now, that being said, you also want to work through the grits. And I know I've said it before. I know you've probably seen other videos that have said it before, but it really is true. The rules can be broken a little bit, just like all rules. I might go from 80 to 100 or 120, but if I go to 120, I'm gonna skip 150 and go to 180. I have never found it really necessary to get those grits that are so close to each other, especially the higher that you go. And then I might finish with a 220. And nowadays I primarily use Rubio Monocoat for my finishes, and they recommend between 120 and 180 anyways. So really the only sanding discs I use anymore are 120 and 180. But that being said, you want to go through those discs. If I started with 80 here, just like this, and then I skip to 180, 180 doesn't have a good chance of erasing all those marks. Now I want to be very clear on something. If I use 80 grit on here, I should not be getting pigtails. There's a common misconception, and I don't know where it comes from, that the lower the grit, the more pigtails you're gonna get. And by the time you get to like grit 7 million, there's just never a chance to get pigtails. And it's nothing but a lie, and I don't know where it comes from, but it's ridiculous. I can sand this entire board with 60 grit on here and not have any pigtails. It'll be rough and there'll be scratches for sure, but there won't be swirl marks in it because I'm gonna slow down and I'm gonna follow all the other tips that I've already talked about to make sure that I don't get the swirl marks. If that's the desired finish that I want at 60 grit, then away I go. But each time I go through the grits, I wanna make sure I completely erase all the scratches from the other ones. So we're slowly knocking down that material to get down to those 60 or 80 grit marks. And I think that's why I've now had more success since I've switched to Rubio, is because by the time my parts and pieces get put together, I've already basically sanded or milled to 120 anyways. So a light touch with 120 and then I go to 180 and we're good. And Rubio leaves a nice soft touch anyways. So I've had no problems since then. I'm not going from 80 to 220 anymore. It's cut back on my sanding time a lot, and I think a lot of that's just due to the fact of the requirements of the finish, but maybe that's a topic for another day. Either way, if you go at the 80 or whatever you start with, make sure that you clean that all up before you go to the next one. If you don't, let's say you start with 80, you go to 100 or 120, then you go up to 150 or 180. If you missed a spot at 100, 180 is gonna show you where you missed that spot back at 80, if that makes sense. That's hard to explain. But unless you go to the next grit higher and actually erase all those scratch marks, the next grit up isn't gonna do you any favors. They'll kind of soften them a little bit, but they're not gonna be able to actually cut through. And then what's gonna happen is you'll see that you missed some swirly marks back at the 80 grit phase, and you're gonna have 180 on here, and you go, well, I know what I'll do. I'll just really sand the heck out of it. It doesn't work that way, because now you're gonna end up digging a hole to get down to that, but only in that one area, and you're gonna have a crummy surface. So do yourself a favor, slow down, go with the ruler trick, lay it on there and go slow, but work through all the grits, again, making sure that you don't have anything between here or any creases or anything on here. Now, sometimes you're gonna do the ruler trick, you're gonna make sure there's no debris and all the things that I've said again already, and you're still gonna end up with a not pleasant surface. And let's face it, it could just be that your sander's a piece of junk. It happens, that's okay. Maybe it was a piece of junk when you bought it and you've been fighting it the whole time. Maybe it's just worn out because you've just been using it too much, which, hey, good for you. Just take a block of wood of some sort, or if you have sanding blocks or sponges, put some sandpaper on there, some regular sandpaper, and just kind of knock down whatever there was. But whatever the paper is you put on here, you want it to be whatever the last disc was that you had on here. So if you wanted 220 to be your final finish, put some 220 at least on here, if not even some 320, and then go with the grain. For the love of God, please go with the grain. I see high-end furniture people go against the grain all the time, and it drives me nuts. Go with the grain. It's super easy. It takes very little time, very little time. And what you're gonna do is you're just kind of mow over the swirls that you might have on there and sort of level them all out. And it works really well. Sanding spudges work really good for contours. Again, you gotta go with the grain though, because if you have a round over on this whole thing, when you get down here, you don't wanna go against the grain here because you're gonna cause yourselves a lot of problems when it comes to finishing. So kind of sweep it down this way as you go, but it'll pay big dividends when you do it that way. Now, I want to give you guys 2 more things before I go. One is to help yourself learn how to sand a little bit better. If you're finding it difficult to get a piece of lumber that you don't mind sanding the crap out of, and potentially not being able to use that again, go to the hardware store or online, wherever you can, and grab yourself a piece of clear acrylic or even black acrylic, which will work even better. And use this as a test. So put your sander on here, sand on this end the way that you normally sand, just scrub the heck out of it or whatever the case might be. And then on this end, practice going 1, 2, right? And slow down and actually try it. And what you can do is you can kind of hold it up to the light, or you can rake the light against it, and you can kind of see what the difference is. You can see where those pigtails are, and if you really want to get down and dirty with what your sander's doing, take the clear piece, set it here, turn it on for just a second, take it off, turn it off, and then look at what it left behind. And that's going to tell you what happens with what your sander is actually doing, whether it has a flat spot or not, or whether the pad is actually flat, and if it's tolerable or within the right tolerances, I should say, for what you need to do. But it'll really give you a good idea. If you want to really learn how to sand really well, use acrylic. I don't know, you could use an epoxy river table, but I wouldn't recommend practicing on that. But just get something where you can really see those scratch patterns. Now, that being said, one of your best friends will also be a light of some sort. I just use this flashlight here and I rake it across the surface going this way. This is a piece of rough curly maple. I just took a chunk off of here. It's from the store. You can see it's all rough right here. It's got a rough edge on it still. And as I look at it, I can see and feel that it's a little rough, but it doesn't look bad. It just looks like maybe it needs to be sanded. But when I rake the light against it, since it's curly, the grain is going every which way, and every time it starts to come back a different direction, it's painfully obvious right here. Now, I will warn you that you can become quite obsessive over this because the light doesn't lie. It'll show you every single scratch and defect in this to begin with, like everything. It'll tell you what's wrong with the wood itself. And that can make you get a little bit crazy. So don't go down that road. No one else is ever going to be inspecting your work this way. But what I do still to this day is if it's on a very show side, right? So the top of a table that's going to be used a lot, the front of a drawer that's going to be seen all the time. It's front and center. And I really want it to be nice. I'll just rake the light across it. You can do it between each grit if you really want a good finish. But I do it after my final finish, and then I just kind of rake the light across it like this to see if there's any imperfections. But like I say, it'll show you every scratch and imperfection in that material. So use that with caution. I think that's all I got for you guys today. This video is probably longer than some of you wanted or expected, and that's fine. But we're here to learn. That's all I got for you guys today. Thanks so much for watching as always, and we'll see you guys in the next video.